I'm with Dr. Sanjay Baru, Distinguished Fellow at the United Service Institution, which is a top think tank of the Indian Armed Forces here in India. Dr. Baru is also a very well-known political analyst and a strategic affairs commentator. And I'm Jyoti Malhotra. I'm based in New Delhi. And this is the Asian Peace Program of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Welcome, Dr. Baru, to this edition.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you.
So, first of all, you've written a piece for the Asia Research Institute, which is called India Can Still Be a Bridge to the Global South. And you talk about, of course, the G20, which India is leading this year, the world's 20 largest economies. But first of all, before I ask you what measures you think India should take to be this bridge, I was wondering if you could lay out the land, as it were. The G20 foreign ministers meeting has just taken place in Delhi a month or so ago. And remember, we did not have a communique from that meeting. The summit is coming up in a few months' time, probably in September, where all the big leaders are likely to be there, the American president, the Russian president, hopefully the Chinese president as well. So if you can just sort of lay out the land, if you like, and tell us what's going on with the G20 this year.
Thank you, Jyoti. I think we are at a very interesting moment in the run-up to the New Delhi summit of the G20. We have on the one hand, India, which is chairing this year's meeting, is a host country, wanting to keep the focus on the interests of the global south, on issues like developing country debt, on climate finance, and so on. And on the other hand, we have the G7 countries, which want to talk about Ukraine and want to comment on Ukraine. Now, the fact is that G20 is not a forum for discussing international security issues. It has not done so in the past. The G20 is a forum for economic and financial issues, which is what it has always been. So there are two viewpoints, and India has been repeatedly saying that let's focus on the concerns of the developing world. To the extent that the war in Ukraine has impacted the developing countries, those are issues like inflation, issues like high oil prices. But that is not simply about the war in Ukraine. It's also about the response to the war in Ukraine, the sanctions imposed by the West, also the quantitative easing that had taken place earlier. So there are far more factors responsible for global inflation than merely the war in Ukraine. So I think that these two viewpoints and how this debate will emerge will define the outcome of the New Delhi summit. Okay.
Now, you mentioned the G7. Now, the G7 summit is also taking place in a few weeks' time in Hiroshima in Japan. And of course, the G20 summit will take place a few weeks after that. But when you talk about India and the role that India can possibly play, so how can India be a peace builder by bringing these two sort of disparate viewpoints together?
Well, India is trying, but so far neither India nor China nor anyone else has succeeded because there is no willingness on the part of the United States and, of course, Ukraine to come to the discussion table, to declare a ceasefire and indulge in a conversation on where to go from here. I mean, the Ukrainians expect Russia to withdraw to its earlier borders. The Americans want to beat the hell out of the Russians. So we have a situation on the ground which is not yet willing to accept any mediation for a ceasefire. I think the first requirement for peace is a ceasefire, which does not prejudice the final outcome as far as the Russia's claim to those territories are. But if the Ukrainians and the West, particularly the United States, are not willing to accept a ceasefire, then this war will continue. So as a consequence, India is saying, look, let us focus on the real problems of the developing world. I mean, this is a European war, as Jaishankar has said many times. It's a war of the West. We have had wars in the last 20 years that G20 has been around. G20 has been around since 2008. There's the Iraq war, there's the Afghanistan war. There were other conflicts. Those did not prevent the G20 from focusing on its core agenda. And none of those summits discussed, these political conflicts or military conflicts. So I think the Indian effort is to get the focus on to developing country interests And, if India succeeds, then we'll have a successful summit. Otherwise, New Delhi will prove like Bali, there'll be no outcome.
But Dr. Baru, I mean, you're sounding a bit pessimistic, but can I just say that the Ukraine conflict has gone on for more than a year or so, right? Now, India, in a sense, is in a bit of a special position. I'm not going to say a unique position, but it is in a special position because it has continued to maintain very good ties with Russia. In fact, India-Russia trade has now zoomed up quite a bit. It's just under $40 billion, and that makes India one of Russia's 5 largest trading partners. But of course, Russia is not trading with the West anymore after sanctions were applied after the Ukraine conflict. So if India has this continuing relationship with the Russians, India has a good relationship with the US. So do you think that it's possible in any way for India to sort of push both sides in these G20 meetings in the run-up to the summit for, to sort of bang the heads of all sides and say, hey, the needs of the global south need to be met, are so important, so you guys should get your act together?
Well, look, I don't think India has left any stone unturned. India, in its own way, has been trying, but nobody is listening. That's the reality. If the West was willing to listen to India, the United States, Germany, France were willing to listen to India, there would have been some movement forward. But the Russians have made it very clear that they are in favor of a ceasefire. Lavrov has said it. President Putin himself, I think, also said it. But certainly Lavrov has said it. They're willing to look at a ceasefire. So as far as Russians are concerned, they are willing for a ceasefire. But the West is not yet willing for a ceasefire. Unless there's a ceasefire, without prejudice to future claims, territorial claims, the war will not stop. It will continue. Now, I don't think we should exaggerate India's influence. My own view is that, whatever Prime Minister Modi could try, he has tried. I don't see him having, moved very much on this front. The US is not clearly willing to listen to India. And even the G7, I mean, come on, look, the G7's focus has not been on developing countries. And I think, even when Prime Minister Kishida came to Delhi as chair of the G7, his focus was all on Ukraine. And I think, or on the Indo-Pacific. I think we have come to a point in global affairs when the developing world has to tell the developed countries, this is time you focused on our future, whether in the area of climate change or climate finance and adaptation, access to technology, intellectual property rights, healthcare, access to removal of IPR in case of vaccine and dealing with pandemics, on developing country debt. I mean, these are all issues of concern to the developing world. And unless the developed countries are willing to address these issues, how is there a way forward? So, Delhi summit, in my view, as of now, stares the fate of the Bali summit. It could just end without any joint agreement.
So would you say that this is like a new Cold War in the offing, not one between two blocs like we had in the past between the former Soviet Union and the US, but really between the global South and the global North?
Well, I don't think one can use the framework of a Cold War, and certainly it's not between global South and global North. I think the fact is that the real tension is between the East and the West, is Russia and China on one side, and the EU and US and Japan on one side. So it's still very much an East-West conflict. I think the role that India has tried to play, or the space that India has tried to occupy, when Foreign Minister Jaishankar said that India remains the voice of the global South. What India is trying to do is to tell both the East and the West, focus on our issues, focus on our problems. After all, in some ways, even China is being told, because China is now one of the biggest debtors. It has lent more money than IMF and World Bank put together to a large number of developing countries. So in this East-West conflict, we are saying that please don't lose sight of the global South. In fact, let me add here one thing, which my friend Kishore Mahbubani has also emphasized in his writings, which is that the G20 at the heads of government level took birth in 2008, 2009 to address the transatlantic financial crisis. And it did so successfully. It injected $5 trillion into the global economy. It trebled the shareholding of IMF and the World Bank. it created institutions like the Financial Stability Mechanism and the Financial Stability Board, etc., etc. So when the West was in trouble, the G20 intervened to help the West stabilize. The US Treasury Secretary was half the time in Beijing, reaching out to China for help, and the Chinese helped. Now when the global South is in trouble, and we are saying to the developed countries, please focus on our interests, these guys want you to focus on Ukraine. So I think the real issue is come back to the original agenda of the G20, which is the stabilization of the global economy, of global trade, of global finance. These are the original agenda items of G20. Ukraine war will go on like Afghanistan went on right through the last decade till the Americans flew out of it. So let those two be separated.
So these issues that you have so eloquently put that the G20 should take a call on, and you talk in your piece also about the need to revitalize multilateralism in trade. You talk about how the global north should give more money, more than the $100 billion that has been promised at the COP27 for climate finance. You talk about debt relief for developing economies, and the exemption from intellectual property rights of COVID vaccines. Now, in a sense, these issues have sort of been pushed into the background because, like you said, because of the Ukraine conflict. So, can India then push these issues right up front during the summit, perhaps the G20 summit, even if both sides are talking past each other, even if you're saying that the West is consumed with the Ukraine conflict and the global South is talking about these other issues, can there be some sort of a compromise, do you think, between these two sort of disparate viewpoints?
Yes, well, India has certainly been trying to do that. And if you see all the statements coming out of New Delhi, the focus has very much been on. But Jyoti, I think the challenge right now is for India to get Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Joseph Biden into the same room in New Delhi. It is still not clear whether we will have all three in the room. They were not there in Bali. Putin did not come because Putin was told, if you come, we will all walk out. Now, if the West says again that if Putin lands up in New Delhi, we'll all walk out, then there's no New Delhi summit. So I think that right now the challenge, even before we can convince these countries to think about the interests of the global South, the challenge is to make sure they first enter the same room, sit at the same table, and talk to each other. Once they begin to do that, then we can push our agenda or the agenda of the global South. But if everybody only talks about Ukraine and they don't allow Putin to come in, or they don't want to listen to Putin, you think President Putin will come to Delhi and speak if he has no audience? Come on, he's just going to walk away.
No, I think
Xi Jinping.
Well, President Putin, I think, will likely come to New Delhi. Of course, nobody knows what's going to happen because he has been sanctioned by the West. So in a sense, he would like to come to New Delhi and put forward his point of view. But you're absolutely right. To get the three big leaders, Putin, Xi Jinping, and Joe Biden in the same room will be, I'm sure India will have its task cut out. But talk to us a little bit about China and the role that Xi Jinping can play.
It's interesting because in some ways, at the beginning of G20, and I keep reminding people in India all the time, that India owes its membership of G20 to China. Mm-hmm. Let's not forget the origins of G20. First of all, the finance ministers G20 was created after the Asian financial crisis, when the West suddenly found China coming in and helping Thailand and Indonesia and the Southeast Asian economies. There was this Chiang Mai initiative. The Chinese started, increasing their influence in Southeast Asia. Then the West woke up and said, "Oh my God, the Chinese have, become so influential in the financial and the economic system. Now let's bring them into the room." They had already brought Russia into the room with G8. G7 had become G8, and they could have made it G9 by bringing China in. But I think the experience with Putin already was not so good. Which is why finally they asked Putin to leave in 2014. Once again, G8 became G7. But instead of bringing China alone, President Sarkozy suggested to George Bush in 2008 September, let's bring all these BRICS countries, Brazil, India, South Africa, Mexico, all these other guys whom we invite as outreach members to our G7 summits, which they started doing in 2003. That's how G20 was first created.
Right.
At the finance ministers level, and then after the Asian financial crisis, at the global, at the heads of government level. They wanted China in the room, but they didn't want China alone in the room, so they brought in India, Brazil, South Africa. That's the game. So China has been a beneficiary of the G20 in the sense that its global profile has gone up. It, of course, is now the world's second largest economy and the largest trading nation with huge amount of foreign exchange surplus. So China is sitting pretty. I mean, the only problem China faces right now is that it is now become a debtor. There are many developing countries that are worried about what they owe China, where India is now able to step in and appear as if it's the savior. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, they're indebted to China, but then India has stepped in to help Sri Lanka, right?
Right.
So this is a game going on, but at the end of the day, China is the second largest economy. And there can be no successful G20 without the Chinese in the room.
So in this situation, when India and China right now have a border conflict, and at least a border standoff, in these circumstances, and like you said, India should acknowledge the fact that it was China that helped to bring India into the G20. How does India repair its bridges with China, if only to have a successful G20 summit and perhaps beyond?
Well, I think there India and China have been more mature than the West. We have said that this border issue is in a separate table. We have not brought it into G20. After all, the border problem has been there for a long time. Even in the recent past, after Doklam and Dipsang, etc., we've had G20 summits. So India and China have actually acted more maturely than the West in saying that this is a bilateral problem. We will discuss it in a different area. We will not allow that to spoil our meetings in the framework of SCO, which is incidentally also going to meet in Delhi, or in the framework of G20, or in the framework of BRICS. And so we have kept the bilateral out of all of these trilaterals, multilaterals, etc., plurilaterals.
So how does then China become, could China, you also said that that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, as we have seen, are coming closer and closer together. So could China then play some sort of a healer, or could it be the glue that brings both sides together at the New Delhi summit?
No, I'm not sure that the relationship between India and China today is good enough for them to come together to solve the Ukraine problem. Each one will try to...
So can China bring the Russians to the table? Can India and the other countries bring the Americans to the table? India also has a good relationship with Putin. So, can people be sort of persuaded to at least sit at the table and talk to each other, even if they don't like each other?
Well, as I said, that is exactly what India is trying. It's not as if India is not trying. India has been consistently trying to bring everybody to the table. But so far, it has not succeeded. Maybe the Chinese are also trying. I don't know what they're doing behind the scenes. But I don't think there's any lack of effort. I think the real issue is the US and the West seems to think that they can, deal a fatal blow to Russia. They can at least try and get rid of Putin in Russia, building on the anger of the Russian people, etc. And as long as that is the objective of the West, why will they give up? If regime change is the objective, if recovery of territory is the objective, if giving Crimea back to Ukraine is objective, then whatever India, China, others try, the West will plod on, and the Russians will have to defend their gains.
So, in a sense, also, Dr. Baru, this is the leadership that the Global South has been seeking for a while, but in this year, in this very difficult year with the Ukraine conflict, with everybody obsessed about the conflict and its possible resolution and how it's going to be resolved. So the Global South then again becomes, is defanged, would you say?
Yes, I think the Prime Minister Modi's attempt to convene a summit of the Global South. It's called Voice of the Global South Summit. We invited some 125 heads of government online. I don't think that has taken off. I think that proved to be a non-starter. Some issues were identified, but I think that was an excessively ambitious effort. I would have preferred, and I've written this in some of my columns, if only 4 countries came together, which is Indonesia, the former chairman, India, the present chairman, Brazil, the next chairman, that's the Troika, and South Africa, the few chairman after Brazil. If these 4 countries, with Jokowi, Lula, Modi, and the current Prime Minister of South Africa, if these 4 actually come together and arrive at some kind of an understanding, common understanding, that may be far more effective than this 125 leaders. Mr. Modi always bites off more than he can chew. And I think that 125 leaders thing was a waste of time. I don't think much came out of it.
But this ginger group that you're talking about, the previous G20 chair, Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, this ginger group could then, in a sense, potentially, if they came together and the 4 big leaders came together in the same room. I mean, this is BRICS without China, isn't it? Basically, Indonesia is there, of course, but...
Yeah, I would put it differently. This is IBSA with Indonesia.
IBSA with Indonesia, that's right. So IBSA with Indonesia, yeah. So a double I, if you expand IBSA with a double I. Now, this ginger group can surely, I think between these 4 countries, you have nearly 2 billion people. I mean, India is 1.4 billion people. And so if these if leaders of these 4 countries can sort of, push forward their arguments of the voice of the Global South and the arguments of the Global South, surely the others should sit up and listen.
Yes, of course. I mean, forget about the population numbers. In Latin America, President Lula is a very influential figure. He's a highly regarded, respected figure.
And he's just become president.
And generally, South Africa's leadership of the African continent is generally accepted, though there's Nigeria also there and Kenya. But point is, Indonesia and India are the former and present chair of G20. And therefore, there is a forum there, potentially. And if these 4 leaders come together, which will require some understanding among themselves first, then they can speak with one voice. And speaking with one voice is far more effective than having simply numbers on your side, which is heterogeneous group, which is a so-called Global South.
So do you think, just to come back to the China question, China, which has this huge influence across our region, and certainly, like you said, the 2nd largest economy in the world, do you think China should play a more sort of an obvious role, or should it push things a little bit more?
Well, China will do what it can. The Chinese leadership has not shied away from playing the role. As I keep saying, in 2008, 2009, don't forget the Chinese were very, very active in bailing out Western economies. So when it suits their interest, they will certainly act. But the Chinese see themselves in a different league now. They see themselves as the rising global power, the 2nd biggest economy, the biggest trading nation. So they will act on their own rather than be persuaded by others.
Should India reach out to China more, Dr. Baru, do you think, on the G20?
I think in general, India should reach out to China, as indeed India should reach out to all its neighbors, every single neighbor. Despite all our differences, and these differences have a long history and they may continue for a long time, I think we need to actually work with our neighbors, not create a situation where we are not even talking to them. Flow of civilians has come down, flow of students has come down, tourists has come down, business has come down. I think we need to have a much more active people-to-people, business-to-business relations with all our neighbors, even if government-to-government relations are not that good. But by personalizing foreign policy, making it almost as if it's a manifestation of the ego of the Prime Minister, I think we have created a situation where any concession is seen as an ego problem rather than a national being in the national interest. I think it's in India's national interest to have a normal relationship with China while having this conversation about the border issue. That was the basis of our relationship till the recent past. Chinese, of course, have taken possession of some Indian land, which the government still does not accept. But whatever it is, I mean, these are all issues that should be discussed separately, while we continue to have a much more active civil society and intellectual and business engagement.
And yet, Dr. Baru, you said yourself that the Indian government has taken a step back by not linking the border issue with the G20. So it's not as if India is saying that that you cannot, that you're not telling the Chinese that you can't come to the G20, because that would, in a sense, be counterproductive for India, right? And you want to be seen to be playing a big role on the world stage. And the second point that I'd like to make and to ask you is that despite the 3 years of the border tensions with China, trade between India and China has only gone up to China's benefit. If multilateral trade is really increasing because of China, and this is true not just for India, but also for the US and the European Union, then surely China has a power and it has a role to play beyond what it has done so far, perhaps.
I think that's a very good question. It's a subject I've been thinking about. I think what we find happening is that the business relationship is being driven by business interests. And a lot of Indian companies have become dependent on imports from China. So the government is saying, if I want the Indian economy to grow, then I'll have to allow Indian firms to import what they need. And China is a low-cost supplier, and therefore let this go on. Now, I think that's a good idea. I think that policy is good. But therefore, what I want is a clear statement of policy. No, we say neighborhood first. I have still not understood what does neighborhood first mean. What does it translate into? Whether it's about movement of people, movement of goods, whatever. I mean, what does neighborhood first mean? Or are we saying neighborhood first with everybody except China and Pakistan? Then let us say it. I think with China, we are actually doing more trade. At the same time, the popular opinion, which is encouraged in the social media by the so-called Sangh Parivar, is to damn China all the time. So let's have an adult relationship. That's my view.
So the parameters of this adult relationship, I mean, on the one hand, you do have, So the parameters of this adult relationship, India and the US have a good relationship. India is buying more from China. India's ties with Putin are quite good with the Russians. So you don't think that you can bang everybody's heads together and say, listen, sit down, talk, and come out with a solution?
No, I think right now our relationship with Russia and the United States is good at an individual level. So we have a good equation with Russia, we have a good equation with the United States. But I don't think we are in a position to actually bring them onto the same table. I think that level of influence we do not. And there's no point pretending that we have. I don't think Putin and Biden will meet merely because Narendra Modi thinks it's good that they meet. But on the other hand, Biden and India and the US will have a strong relationship. They will continue to have a strong relationship. And don't forget, the US and Russia are competing for the same market in India, the defense market. And India has reduced its imports from Russia, increased its imports from the United States. This market for Indian defense imports, they are both competitors. So both woo us because they are both suppliers. But I don't think as parallel suppliers or competitive suppliers, they are willing to actually come together merely because we think it's a good idea.
Having said that, Dr. Baru, the US-China trade has also gone up, even though the US believes that China is its greatest competitor. But then trade is going up. So, leaders are saying one thing publicly, but actually behind the scenes or behind the parda, other things are happening.
Of course. I mean, this was something that, many of us have written. In fact, I wrote almost more than a year back that the word decoupling does not suggest what is happening. What is happening is de-risking. And today you Google and you see more and more people are saying this. A lot of Americans are now saying it. But I remember writing over a year ago that what the West is doing is not decoupling. What it is doing is de-risking. So that means the additional, reduce dependence on China and then move out of China to somewhere else. And where are they moving? They're moving to Thailand, they're moving to Bangladesh, they're moving to Vietnam, they're moving to Indonesia. They are not yet moving to India. Very few American companies have walked out of China and walked into India. One or two have, but it's not as big as what they're doing with Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries. Same with Japan. Japan too is de-risking, not decoupling. Europe certainly, I don't think is even decoupling. Europe's dependence on China is so huge that Scholz ran to Beijing, Macron ran to Beijing. All of them are running to Beijing. Why? Because Beijing is an important market for Europe.
Right. On this note, Dr. Baru, thank you for your time and for speaking so frankly, actually, about all the challenges in this G20 year that India is leading, whether it's Joe Biden, Vladimir Putin, or Xi Jinping, and whether all these three big powers will sit on the table along with the other 17 heads of state and government who show up in New Delhi. So lots of food for thought. Thank you again. I'm Jyoti Malhotra here in New Delhi, and this edition is for the Asian Peace Program at the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore. Thank you all so much for watching.
Thank you.